Good day, everyone. Today we begin our discussion of Catholic higher education and integral human formation. Our subject may initially appear to be about universities, like what makes a university Catholic, or what should a Catholic university teach, how should it organize its curriculum. But I want to begin somewhere deeper. The real subject is the human person. Because before we can ask what should a university do or a Catholic university do, we first have to ask what is a university for. And before we can answer that, we have to ask who is the human being whom the university is trying to educate. That is the fundamental question. Education is never neutral. So, whenever we educate someone, we already have some idea, explicitly or implicitly, of what a human being ought to become. If I think the purpose of education is primarily employment, then I will design education around employability. If I think education is primarily about economic productivity, then I will measure success through income, employment rates, rankings, and productivity. If I think education is primarily about acquiring information, then I will measure success through examinations and grades. But Catholic education makes a much larger claim. It says that the person entering the university is not merely a future employee. The student is not simply a future doctor, psychologist, engineer, lawyer, teacher, researcher, or administrator. The student is first of all a human person. And therefore, education must be concerned with the formation of that whole person. That is why the title uses the expression integral human formation. Integral comes from the idea of wholeness. We are asking whether intellectual development, psychological development, moral development, relational development, spiritual development, and vocational development can somehow belong together. Our central concern throughout these slides will therefore be simple. What kind of human being are we helping this person become? That question will guide everything that follows. The presentation itself is framed explicitly as higher Catholic higher education and integral human formation. Before we move forward, let's ask first, where have we been? Before, so this lecture does not stand by itself. It grows out of the previous weeks of our course. Our course began with the human person. In week 1, we asked the most basic anthropological question: who is the human person? In week 1, we asked, so Catholic anthropology, in week 1, we've understood Catholic anthropology to give us a foundational conviction. The human being is embodied, relational, free, historical, and spiritual. Most importantly, the human person is created in the image of God and called into communion with God. Notice the importance of that. We are not spirits trapped inside bodies, but neither are we simply biological organisms. We are embodied. We are relational. We become ourselves through relationships with parents, families, communities, teachers, friends, cultures, and ultimately with God. Then in week 2, we move from being to becoming. We ask, how does this human person develop? And this brought us into conversation with Erikson, Piaget, Kohlberg, Fowler, Keegan, and Parks. These thinkers help us understand that human beings develop psychologically, cognitively, morally, socially, and spiritually. But we also introduced an important qualification. Psychological development and holiness are not identical. Someone can be psychologically mature without being a saint. Someone can be deeply religious and nevertheless carry psychological wounds or immature patterns. We must resist reducing spirituality to psychology and equally resist pretending that spirituality makes psychology irrelevant. Then in week 3, we examined religious experience. We encountered James, Freud, Jung, Frankl, Rizzuto, Capps, and Pargament. We asked questions about prayer, conversion, meaning, God images, religious scoping, and spiritual experience. And we arrive at another important principle. Religious experience may be psychologically mediated without being merely psychological. That distinction is crucial. When someone prays, psychological processes are occurring. When someone experiences conversion, psychological processes are involved. When someone develops an image of God, personal history and relationships may influence that image. But saying that an experience has psychological dimensions does not prove that the experience is nothing but psychology. And now we arrive at week 4. The question changes. Previously, we concentrated primarily upon the person. Now we ask about the environment that forms the person. The presentation describes these directly. We move from the individual person to the institution. And the new question becomes, what kind of community can foster the integral development of the whole person? That is our transition. Week 1, who is the person? Week 2, how does the person develop? Week 3, how does the person experience meaning, faith, and transcendence? Week 4, what kind of community helps that person become whole? And that brings us to the Catholic University. The central question of week 4. Here is our central question. What does it mean for a Catholic university to form the whole person? I want us to remain with this question because it contains almost the entire lecture. Notice that we're not merely asking what makes a university Catholic. That could easily become an institutional checklist. Does it have theology subjects? Does it have a chapel? Does it celebrate Mass? Does it have crucifixes in classrooms? Or does it have a campus ministry office? Those are important questions, but they are insufficient. Our question is more fundamental. What happens to persons because they spend years inside this institution? That is formation. A university is never simply a building containing classrooms. It is an environment of formation. Students spend years there. They encounter professors. They develop friendships. They encounter authority. They experience success and failure. They compete. They collaborate. They discover ideas. They encounter people who disagree with them. They experience institutional rules. They observe how leaders behave. They discover what the institution actually rewards. All of these experiences communicate something about what life means. The presentation puts this very clearly. Education forms habits, shapes imagination, creates relationships, establishes ideals, forms conscience, and influences how people understand themselves and the world. So, education is much larger than the transmission of information. Consider a college student studying medicine. The university certainly teaches anatomy, physiology, pathology, pharmacology, diagnosis, and treatment. But during those years, the student is also learning, perhaps without realizing it, what counts as success. What does it mean to suffer? How should I treat vulnerable people? What does power mean? What is my responsibility toward another person's body? What is death? What does it mean to care? What kind of physician do I want to become? Those questions may never appear in a multiple choice examination, yet they may ultimately be more important than many things that do. This leads to one of the most important statements in the entire presentation. Every university forms persons, whether or not it explicitly acknowledges that it is doing so. There's no completely neutral university. Every institution has values. Every institution rewards certain behaviors. Every institution communicates what it considers important. Every institutional culture proposes some vision of the good life. Therefore, the question is not, does the university form people? It does. The real question is, toward what kind of person are we forming our students? That is the question I want us to carry throughout this lecture. So, we need to ask, what is education for? Modern discussions about higher education frequently begins with employability. The presentation acknowledges these explicitly. Universities provide qualifications that allow people to find employment and achieve some degree of economic security. And we should immediately say there's nothing wrong with that. Students need jobs, families sacrifice enormously for education, parents send children to university hoping that education will create opportunities. Students need professional competencies. Societies need engineers, physicians, psychologists, teachers, nurses, researchers, lawyers, public servants, and other professionals. So, Catholic education does not say that employability is unimportant. Instead, Catholic education asks, is employability enough? Suppose a university produces excellent engineers. They're highly employable. They are technically brilliant, but they use their knowledge irresponsibly. Has the university succeeded? Suppose we produce highly competent business leaders who generate enormous profits but exploit workers. Have we educated them well? Suppose we produce brilliant lawyers who know precisely how to manipulate the law for powerful clients. Have we formed good lawyers? Suppose we produce outstanding researchers who publish extensively but fabricate data. Can we call that educational excellence? This is where Catholic education pushes the question further. Education must certainly ask what can you do, but it must also ask what will you do with what you can do. And even more deeply, who are you becoming through what you are learning to do? The difference is subtle but profound. A university that asks only about competence produces factionaries. A university committed to formation asks about persons. This is why Catholic education cannot finally be satisfied with the question, did our graduate get jobs? We have to ask, what kind of human beings entered those professions? beyond mere competence. This slide will sharpen the distinction. Is a physician merely someone technically capable of treating disease? Is a lawyer merely someone capable of practicing law? Is a psychologist merely someone capable of conducting assessment and therapy? The presentation answers no. But notice what Catholic education is not saying. It's not saying competence does not matter. Quite the opposite. Professional competence genuinely matters. A poorly trained doctor is dangerous. An incompetent engineer can cost lives. A poorly trained psychologist can harm clients. An incompetent teacher can damage students. So rigorous disciplinary formation is itself a moral responsibility. The presentation therefore explicitly affirms that professional competence and rigorous preparation are part of the institution's responsibility both to the students and to society. But competence creates another question. For whom and for what is this competence exercised? That is the Catholic question. Knowledge gives power. Education gives capacity. Professional training allows a person to intervene in other persons' lives. Therefore, competence cannot be its own justification. The competent physician possesses power over vulnerable bodies. The competent psychologist enters deeply into another person's interior life. The competent lawyer possesses specialized knowledge that clients may not understand. The competent researcher produces knowledge that can influence policy. The competent public administrator exercises authority affecting communities. So the ethical question becomes unavoidable. What is your competence for? The presentation says that excellence must find its purpose in something beyond personal achievement. This brings us to Gravissimum Educationis, Vatican II's Declaration on Christian Education. The document gives us a precisely concise understanding of education. A true education aims at the formation of the human person in the pursuit of his ultimate end and of the good of the societies of which as man he is a member. There are two directions here. Education is directed toward the fulfillment of the person, but education is also directed toward the good of society. This means Catholic education rejects two reductions. It rejects individualism. My education is simply for my success. And it rejects utilitarianism. The student exists simply to serve economic or institutional needs. So instead, the human person is formed toward personal flourishing and the common good that is already a very different philosophy of education. So there are two simultaneous orientations of education. That is contained in the Gravissimum Educationis. Catholic education must hold them together. First, the ultimate good of the person. The student is not being educated merely to succeed. The student is being formed toward the discovery of his or her deepest calling, to live in accordance with human dignity and ultimately within the horizon of the love of God. This changes the meaning of success. Imagine a graduate student who earns a great deal of money, becomes famous, gains influence, and receives numerous awards. Has this person flourished? Perhaps. But those things alone cannot answer the question. Because Catholic anthropology asks about the whole life. Can this person love? Can this person receive love? Can this person remain faithful? Can this person tell the truth when lying would be advantageous? Can this person use power without abusing it? Can this person encounter suffering without immediately fleeing from it? Can this person recognize another human being as having dignity independent of usefulness? Can this person discern a vocation? Can this person ask what God may be calling him or her to become? These questions move education from success toward flourishing. But there is a second orientation, the good of the community. My education is never mine alone. The presentation makes this point. The gifts, capacities, freedoms cultivated through education are not intended to be placed at the service of others, are intended to be placed at the service of others and to contribute to the common good. This is where profession begins to become vocation. My intelligence is not simply my possession. My education is not simply my achievement. My professional competence is not simply my advantage. They are also gifts that create responsibilities. If I know something that others do not know, that knowledge gives me responsibility. If I possess professional power, that power creates responsibility. If education gives me opportunities unavailable to many others, those opportunities raise a moral question. What will I do with what I have received? And notice something especially significant for our course on HAU philosophy and psychology. Gravisum Educationis does not imagine Christian formation as something opposed to psychology or educational science. The presentation notes that the Council explicitly calls upon advances in psychology, pedagogy, and educational science so that young people can develop harmoniously in their physical, moral, and intellectual capacities and gradually mature responsibility. Acquire mature responsibility. That is enormously important. The Catholic vision is not theology instead of psychology. It is not spirituality instead of human development. Rather, grace takes the human person seriously. And therefore, Catholic formation must take human development seriously. This gives us the basic insights. Education is not merely preparation for doing, education is formation for becoming. The question is not merely what the student know, not merely what the student be able to do. The deepest question is, who is this student becoming? And for whom will this person's knowledge, freedom, competence, and life eventually become a gift? That question would lead us directly into where we can distinguish more carefully between instruction and formation, and then ask what vision of the human person must stand underneath Catholic education. Formation is more than instruction. We now arrive at the distinction that is absolutely central to Catholic education, the distinction between instruction and formation. Both are important, but they're not the same. Instruction asks, what does the student know? Formation asks, what kind of person is the student becoming because of what the student knows? Let's make this very concrete. Suppose I teach statistics. At the level of instruction, I want my students to understand variables, distribution, samplings, correlation, regression, hypothesis testing, and statistical significance. Those are legitimate educational objectives. But formation asks another set of questions. Will the student use statistics honestly? Will the student manipulate data to produce a desired conclusion? Will the student understand that behind some data sets are actual human lives? Will the student admit when the evidence contradicts a preferred hypothesis? Will the researcher possess the humility to say, the evidence does not support my claim? That's no longer statistics. That is character. Or imagine that I teach psychology. Instruction asks, can the student explain empathy? Can the student describe personality? Can the student administer an assessment? Can the student identify psychological disorders? Formation asks, has studying psychology made this person more capable of encountering another human being? A person can write an excellent examination about empathy and still be cruel. That is precisely the problem. The presentation therefore says that formation connects knowledge with character, judgment, responsibility, relationships, conscience, and vocation. So, Catholic education does not reject instruction, it radicalizes it. It asks what knowledge is doing to the knower. Every discipline changes us. Philosophy teaches us ways of questioning. Psychology gives us ways of interpreting behavior. Theology gives us ways of understanding God and human existence. Medicine changes the way we encounter bodies, illness, suffering, and death. Law changes the way we understand rights, responsibility, authority, and justice. Therefore, every subject has a formative dimension. The question is whether we recognize it. Yes, this tells us that knowledge can be without character. The presentation gives us several deliberately uncomfortable examples. A person can possess extensive theological knowledge and still be cruel. A psychologist can understand empathy theoretically and fail to practice it. A physician can possess extraordinary technical competence and nevertheless treat patients as objects. A public servant can know the law and manipulate it for personal advantage. Notice what all these examples have in common. Knowledge is present. The problem is not ignorance. The theologian knows theology, the psychologist knows psychology, the physician knows medicine, the public servant knows the law, and yet something is missing. What is missing? Integration. The knowledge has not yet penetrated the person's character. This is why we must be careful when we say someone is educated. What exactly do we mean? Do we mean the person possesses degrees? Do we mean the person has accumulated information? Do we mean the person possesses technical competence? Those things may indicate education, but Catholic education asks whether knowledge has become wisdom. There is a profound difference between knowing about justice and becoming just. There's a difference between knowing about compassion and becoming compassionate. There's a difference between knowing theology and becoming holy. There's a difference between studying ethics and becoming ethical. This is why the presentation concludes, education becomes truly formative only when knowledge becomes connected to character, judgment, responsibility, conscience, service, vocation, and wisdom. And this gives us an important correction regarding Catholic identity. Sometimes Catholic education is imagined primarily in curricular terms. We ask, how many theology units do students take? That's important, yes, but the presentation makes a stronger claim. Catholic identity is not established simply because students take religion classes. A university could require many theology subjects and still possess an institutional culture characterized by dishonesty, exploitation, humiliation, competition, or indifference. The question, therefore, cannot simply be what Catholic subjects do we teach. It must become what kind of persons does our entire educational environment produce. These moves us naturally to anthropology because if we are forming persons, we need to know what is a person. Here we arrive at one of the most important theological foundations of Catholic education. We cite Gaudium et Spes, number 22. Only in the mystery of the incarnate Word does the mystery of man take on light. This is an extraordinary statement. It means that Christianity does not begin simply by telling us something about God. Christ also reveals something about humanity. Christology contains anthropology. So to understand what the human person is called to become, Catholic education looks toward Christ. Gaudium et Spes make the point even more strongly. Christ fully reveals man to man himself and makes his supreme calling clear. That formulation is presented here as the anthropological foundation of Catholic education. So what does this mean educationally? It means Christ cannot simply be one subject among many. Imagine the curriculum: Monday, mathematics; Tuesday, psychology; Wednesday, economics; Thursday, theology; Friday, engineering. If Catholic identity simply means that theology is added to the curriculum, then Christ becomes one topic alongside other topics. But the claim of Catholic education is much deeper. Christ reveals the horizon within which the human person is understood. This affects how we understand dignity, freedom, love, suffering, community, truth, service, vocation, even success. Christ reveals a human life not organized primarily around possession, domination, recognition, or self-preservation. Instead, the life of Christ reveals human fulfillment through truth, communion, self-gift, love, and human relationships, and relationships with Him. Therefore, the Catholic University cannot simply ask, how do we insert Catholic material into our curriculum? The deeper question is, how does our understanding of Christ illuminate our understanding of the human person whom we educate? That is Catholic anthropology. Once we accept that anthropology, the question of education, begins to change, the slide presents three important transformations. The first is not only what can you do, but also who are you? What is the depth of this person's humanity, dignity, and calling? The ordinary university understandably asks about competencies. Can you perform this task? Can you solve this problem? Can you demonstrate this learning outcome? Catholic education asks those questions too, but it refuses to reduce the person to ability because a person's dignity does not depend upon productivity. This becomes especially important when someone says fails. What happens when the excellent student suddenly receives a failing grade? Or what happens when someone becomes sick and cannot perform? Or what happens when someone's career collapses? If identity has been built entirely upon ability, then loss of ability becomes loss of self. Catholic anthropology says you are more than what you can do. The second transformation is not only what do you want, but what are you called to become? The slide says that desire must be informed by vocation and by discernment of genuine goods. This is very important because modern culture often tells us follow your desires. But Catholic formation asks a more fundamental question. Are all desires equally worthy? I may desire wealth, recognition, power, success, comfort, prestige. There's nothing automatically evil about this. But should every desire be obeyed simply because it is mine? Catholic education introduces discernment. Not merely what do I want, but what is genuinely good? What is worthy of my freedom? What am I being called toward? Then comes the third transformation. Not only how can you achieve, but how can achievement contribute to human flourishing? Ability must be ordered toward truth and service rather than merely personal advancement. This means Catholic education does not oppose achievement, it reorients achievement. The issue is not whether you become excellent, but then ask, excellent for what? Become a brilliant physician. For what? Become a successful lawyer. For what? Become an influential academic. For what? Become a powerful administrator. For what? The word that begins to emerge is vocation. And this is why the presentation describes Catholic education as beginning from a vocational anthropology. Human life is not merely constructed by the individual. Identity is also discovered through gifts, relationships, responsibility, and ultimately response to God. The student is therefore not simply an autonomous project saying, I will reinvent or I will invent myself. The student is also someone learning to ask, what have I received and what am I being called to do with it? This leads us to Augustine. Now Augustine enters our discussion, and Augustine takes us deeper. Up to this point, we have been speaking about knowledge, competence, character, and vocation. Augustine asks us to look beneath all of them. He asks, what do you love? The presentation introduces Augustine's educational thought through his philosophy of desire. The human being does not simply think, the human being loves. And what we love shapes who we become. This is one of the most important insights for understanding formation. We often imagine education according to an intellectual model. The student has a mind, the teacher possesses knowledge, the teacher transfers knowledge into the student's mind. Education succeeds when the student remembers the information. Augustine complicates the picture because the student is not merely a thinking thing, the student is a loving person, a desiring person, a restless person. This is why we need to this is why the slide gives us the famous opening of the confessions. You have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. The Latin is worth hearing. Feciste nos ad te, et inquietum es cor nostrum done crescant in te. You have made us toward yourself, and restless is our heart until it rests in you. Notice the word inquietum, restless. The human being is marked by restlessness. We desire, we seek, we reach beyond ourselves, and the presentation identifies some of the objects of this desire: recognition, success, love, truth, belonging, pleasure, security, meaning. None of these is accidental. It means the student who enters our classroom does not enter as pure intellect. The student enters carrying desires, the desire to be recognized, the desire to succeed, the desire to belong, the desire to be loved, the desire to prove oneself, perhaps the desire to please parents, the perhaps fear of failure, perhaps ambition, perhaps genuine desire of knowledge, usually a mixture of many things. Therefore, education is always interacting with desire. And is Augustine's insight is that what we love eventually shapes who we become. If I love recognition above everything else, my life will gradually organize itself around recognition. If I love money above everything else, decision begins organizing themselves around money. If I love power above everything else, relationships become instruments for gaining or preserving power. If I love truth, truth begins shaping my intellectual life. If I love God above all, other loves can gradually find their proper place. So, education cannot concern intelligence alone. It must also concern desire. So, and now Augustine brings us to what may be the most important question in these slides. What do you love? And then the more difficult question, are your loves rightly ordered? Ordo amoris. The presentation makes the problem very clear. A brilliant person may desire destructive things. Knowledge alone does not make someone good. This should unsettle every university because universities are very good at developing intelligence. We know how to teach, we know how to examine, we know how to assess, we know how to award degrees, but intelligence can serve very different masters. A highly intelligent person can use intelligence for justice or manipulation, for healing or exploitation, for truth or deception, for service or domination. So, intelligence alone is not enough. The presentation makes precisely this point. Cognitive ability and academic achievement do not guarantee moral goodness. Extraordinary intelligence can be placed at the service of disordered loves. Augustine therefore shifts the moral question. The moral life cannot be reduced simply to what rules should I follow. There's a deeper question. What am I learning to love? This is why formation must reach desire. Catholic education seeks to engage not only intellect but what the presentation calls the affective center of the person. The deep loves that motivate behavior, shape character, and contribute to identity. Think of a student who studies because he loves truth. Compares that with a student who studies because she cannot tolerate being second. Externally, both may receive the same grade, both may graduate with honors, but internally, something completely different is happening. One may be developing intellectual love, the other may be developing anxiety and compulsive comparison. The transcript may look identical, the formation is not identical. This is why Catholic education cannot evaluate formation only through measurable outcomes. Grades can tell us something, licensure results can tell us something, employment statistics can tell us something, research productivity can tell us something. But none of this tells us completely what has this person learned to love. And this brings us to to the goal that the presentation calls Ordo Amoris, the right ordering of love. The properly educated person is one whose intelligence, freedom, desire, and relationships are becoming increasingly ordered towards the good, the true, the beautiful, and ultimately toward God. Notice the word becoming. Formation is not instantaneous. We are not producing perfect people. Education is not manufacturing saints. Formation is the process of gradual integration. The intellect learns truth. Freedom learns responsibility. Desire learns what is worthy of love. Relationships teach self gift. Conscience learns judgment. And spirituality gradually orients the whole person toward God. So, if we've asked what is education for, now we ask education is the formation of a person. And Augustine now makes that claim even more demanding. To form a person means ultimately to educate not only what the person knows, but what the person loves. This leads us to Ordo Amoris. We've ended the previous section with Augustine's fundamental question, what do you love? But Augustine does not simply divide human beings into those who love and those who do not. Everyone loves. The deeper issue is, are our loves rightly ordered? This is the meaning of Ordo Amoris, the order of love. The presentation explains that the problem is often not that we love evil things, rather, we take something genuinely good and make it ultimate. That distinction is extremely important. Take academic achievement. Is academic achievement good? Of course. Should students desire excellence? Certainly. But what happens when academic achievement becomes the basis of one's entire identity? Then something good has become disordered. The student begins to say, I am valuable because I am excellent, and therefore, if I fail, perhaps I am no longer valuable. The problem is not excellence. The problem is that excellence has been asked to carry a weight it cannot carry. The same thing can happen with career. Career is good. Professional achievement is good. Recognition can be good. Money can be good. Institutional leadership can be good. Even religious ministry can be good. But Augustine asks, where does each love belong? If I make my career my ultimate good, then everything else may gradually become subordinate to career. Family becomes secondary. Friendship becomes useful networking. Colleagues become competitors. Students become evaluations. Research becomes publication counts. Service becomes resume building. Even prayer can become another strategy for success. God, please help me achieve what I want. Notice what happened. Nothing obviously evil entered the picture. The problem was disordered love. This is why Augustine is so useful for educational psychology and spirituality. He helps us see that human dysfunction does not always begin with choosing something obviously bad. Sometimes it begins when we make a relatively good into an absolute good. Integral formation, therefore, means learning how different goods belong together. Achievement is good, but it's not God. Career is good, but it's not the whole person. Recognition is pleasant, but it cannot establish human dignity. Education is valuable, but degrees cannot tell us the ultimate worth of a human being. This is what we mean by ordo amoris. The task of formation is therefore not to eliminate desire, it is to educate desire. That's why we need to learn how to educate desire. Augustine and the interior teacher. We have just discussed Augustine's Ordo Amoris. Education must teach us not only how to think, but how to love well. Now, Augustine takes us to another dimension of formation. He asks a deceptively simple question. How does a person actually learn? In De Magistro, on the teacher, Augustine reflects on the relationship between words, signs, teachings, and understanding. The slide gives us the central insight. Teachers communicate through words and signs, but genuine understanding cannot simply be inserted into another person's mind. The learner must see the truth from within. This is actually very important. When I lecture, what am I actually doing? I produce words, sounds. I write something. I show you a PowerPoint. I recommend a book. I explain Augustine. But can I physically transfer my understanding of Augustine into your mind? No. I can give you signs. But you must understand. Suppose I explain a difficult philosophical concept 5 times. You hear the same words 5 times. Then suddenly you say, now I understand. What happened? The words may have helped, the teacher may have helped, the examples may have helped, but the actual act of understanding occurred within you. That is why this slide emphasizes that learning is never passive. The learner interprets, compares, questions, remembers, integrates, rejects, reconstructs, and applies and appropriates what is encountered. This is a remarkably sophisticated psychology of education. The student is not an empty container. The student is an active subject. And this is precisely why two students can sit in exactly the same classroom, listen to exactly the same professor, read exactly the same text, and yet learn very differently. Because learning involves the whole history and interiority of the learner. One student hears Augustine after experiencing failure, another hears Augustine after experiencing success, another hears Augustine while struggling with faith, another hears him after a profound religious experience. The words may be identical, their appropriation is not. The teacher as accompanist. And this changes the role of the teacher. The slide deliberately uses the word accompanist. The teacher does not manufacture the student. The teacher accompanies the learner toward recognition. Authentic education seeks to awaken the student's own movement towards the truth. This is an important correction to authoritarian models of education. Formation cannot mean I will make you become what I have decided you should become. That's not formation, that's control. Instead, teachers will say, I will accompany you as you learn to recognize truth for yourself. This is why the slide makes the beautiful comparison with spiritual direction. A good spiritual director does not replace the person's conscience. Similarly, a good teacher does not replace the student's intelligence. Both accompany another person toward truth while respecting the interiority of the person's journey. That is a very important connection between psychology, spirituality, and education. The psychologist does not live the client's life. The SD does not replace the directee's conscience. The teacher does not think on behalf of the student. All three are actually involved in a form of accompaniment. And so we might formulate Augustine's pedagogical insight simply: I cannot understand for you, I can accompany you, I can question you, I can challenge you, I can introduce you to texts, I can correct you, I can point, but eventually you must see. This leads us to John Henry Newman, a newly canonized saint, no? last year. So now we move from Augustine to John Henry Newman. There is an important transition here. Augustine helped us think about what happens inside the learner. Newman asks us to think about what happens inside the university. As Newman's central concern is the unity of knowledge. This is enormously important. What does the word university suggest? Think of the word itself. A university contains many disciplines: psychology, philosophy, theology, biology, medicine, engineering, economics, law, political science, sociology, literature, and many others. But the university is not supposedly to be merely a building in which unrelated disciplines happen to occupy different rooms. There must be some sense of the whole. Newman's concern is that knowledge can become fragmented into isolated specializations even though reality itself is not fragmented. Disciplines distinguish aspects of reality for purposes of study, but no single discipline possesses the whole. Let's make this very simple. Imagine a human being sitting in front of us. The psychologist looks at the person and sees cognition, affect, behavior, personality, development, relationships. The biologist sees an organism. The economist may examine behavior in relation to resources, incentives, and choices. The philosopher asks about consciousness, freedom, knowledge, meaning, and the good. And theology considers a person and the reality in relation to God. But these are not different, but complementary disciplinary perspectives. Which one is correct? Potentially all of them. Which one possesses the complete human person? None of them. This is Newman's point. Each discipline illuminates reality from a particular angle, but the human person exceeds every one of these perspectives. So the genuine university must allow disciplines to enter into conversation so that, as the slide puts it, the whole is never lost to the parts. This is especially important for Catholic education. Catholic education does not ask biology to become theology. It does not ask psychology to become philosophy. It does not ask economics to become Catholic social teaching. Rather, it asks, can these disciplines speak to one another? Because truth is one, even when our ways of approaching truth are many. This leads us to the danger of specialization. Newman is not saying specialization is bad, and neither is this lecture. In fact, the slide explicitly acknowledges what specialization gives us: depth, precision, methodological rigor, and the capacity to advance knowledge within a field. We need specialists. Imagine saying, I don't want a specialist to perform my surgery. I want somebody interdisciplinary. No, please give me the specialist. If I need neurosurgery, I want a neurosurgeon. If I need a structural engineer, I want someone who understands structural engineering. If I need psychological assessment, I want a properly trained psychologist. Um, in fact, you never had recordings for a long time because I had a dental surgery and it was done by a dental surgeon, not just a dentist. So the problem is not expertise. The problem arises when expertise become reductionism. The opening sentence says it beautifully. One can know increasingly more about increasingly narrow questions while losing the capacity to see the whole. The result is information without wisdom. That phrase is worth remembering. Information without wisdom. We can possess extraordinary quantities of information and still not know what any of it ultimately means. The slide therefore distinguishes what specialization gains from what it risks. Specialization gains precision, but it can risk loss of perspective, can make interdisciplinary conversation difficult. Most importantly, it can reduce human complexity to whatever a particular method is capable of measuring. This is a profound methodological problem. Every method has a frame, and whatever falls outside that frame can become invisible. Suppose my method measures my only observable behavior. Then I become very good at measuring behavior. But eventually, I may make a mistake. I may begin to think if my method cannot measure it, it is not real. That conclusion does not follow. Your instrument establishes what your instrument can detect. It does not necessarily establish the limits of reality. The same problem can happen in theology. A theologian can become so confident in theological language that psychological complexity disappears. Everything becomes sin, grace, faith, temptation, conversion. These categories are real, but they do not eliminate psychological categories. This is why Newman matters for our course on spirituality and philosophy and psychology. We do not want psychology to swallow spirituality, and we do not want spirituality to swallow psychology. The slide describes Newman's alternative as a university in which disciplines genuinely illuminate one another, holding breadth and depth together while refusing to forget the unity of truth. So the challenge is be a specialist, but do not become intellectually imprisoned by your specialization. Now the presentation gives us a concrete case. Look at the diagram. At the center is lenses of depression. Around the person are different disciplinary perspectives: the neurologist, the psychologist, the sociologist, the economist, the philosopher, and the theologian. This diagram gives us a very practical example of Newman's argument. Imagine a person experiencing depression. What does the neurologist see? The neurologist may investigate neurological and psychological dimensions. What does the psychologist see? The psychologist may consider cognition, affect, behavior, trauma, attachment, personality, coping, and relationships. What might the sociologist see? The sociologist might ask about isolation, family, community, social structures, discrimination, or changing patterns of belonging. The economist might ask about unemployment, poverty, financial security, material circumstances. The philosopher may ask about meaning, suffering, freedom, identity, or hopelessness. And a theologian may ultimately ask the meaning of hope, suffering, faith, prayer, experience of God, or desolation. Now ask, which explanation is the explanation? That is precisely the wrong question. The slide says that these disciplines provide partial but genuine explanation. Each illuminates something, but each remains incomplete. The danger begins when one perspective claims mine is the complete one. For example, depression is nothing but brain chemistry. That is reductionism. But we could commit reductionism in the opposite direction. Depression is simply a lack of prayer. That can be equally problematic. Or if this person had enough faith, this would disappear. Again, we have taken one dimension of human experience and made it the total explanation. This course has repeatedly resisted precisely that temptation. Remember what we established earlier: a religious experience can be psychologically mediated without being merely psychological. Likewise, psychological suffering may possess biological, relational, social, existential, and spiritual dimensions without any one of those dimensions exhausting the phenomenon. And that brings us back to Catholic anthropology. Why must we resist fragmentation? Because the human person exceeds every disciplinary lens. That statement is crucial. The person is always more than our theory about the person. That's why interdisciplinary dialogue is not simply an academic luxury, it's an ethical requirement. It is a form of respect for the complexity of the person. And we move now to my last slide for week 4, part 1. And that leads us to the final concept in the sequence: intellectual humility. The slide immediately makes an important clarification. Interdisciplinary dialogue does not mean eliminating disciplinary differences. Psychology should remain psychology, theology should remain theology, neuroscience should remain neuroscience. This is very important. Integration does not mean confusion. So if psychology stops using psychological methods, it ceases to be psychology. If theology abandons theological reasoning, it ceases to be theology. So interdisciplinary dialogue does not mean everybody says the same thing. Quite the opposite. Dialogue is possible precisely because different disciplines bring different questions, methods, evidence, and perspectives. But the slide proposes one question that every discipline should learn to ask. What can another field reveal that my method cannot? That is an excellent question for a doctoral student. It's an excellent question for a professor. And perhaps even more frequently, it's an excellent question for an expert. Because the more expertise we acquire, the greater the temptation to believe that our expertise explains everything. Intellectual humility means recognizing my discipline reveals something real, but also my discipline does not reveal everything. This is not weakness. So the slide explicitly says intellectual humility is not a concession. It's a sign of mature scholarly reasoning. And now the lecture connects Newman with Pope Francis. The slide invokes Veritatis Gaudium, emphasizing Francis's call for a broad culture of dialogue and for interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches capable of engaging the complexity of human reality. This gives us an important Catholic intellectual principle. Truth does not need us to be afraid of any other discipline. The psychologist does not need to fear theology. The theologian does not need to fear psychology. Faith does not need to fear science. Philosophy does not need to fear empirical research. But every discipline must also know what it can and cannot legitimately claim. So Augustine, truth must be appropriated interiorly. The teacher accompanies the learner toward the truth. Newman, truth must not be fragmented. The disciplines must remain in conversation because reality exceeds every specialization. And Francis, that conversation must become a culture of dialogue capable of engaging the complexity of contemporary human reality. And underneath all three is a single disposition: humility before truth. The teacher does not possess the student, the discipline does not possess reality, and the university does not manufacture truth. We are all, in different ways, seekers of truth. And that provides the transition for week 2, part 2, beginning with the slide, Ex Corde Ecclesiae, and the question, what makes a university Catholic? Please reflect about what we've been talking about in this week 4, part 1 lecture. Thank you very much, everyone.